They say money talks, but sometimes, silence screams louder. Especially when that silence is paired with the subtle flick of side eyes, the polite tension of a fake smile, and assumptions that hit like bricks. It was a cool morning in Santa Barbara. The private tarmac bathed in a soft, ethereal light. A gentle breeze rustled, barely disturbing the sleek, polished shell of a Gulfstream G650, poised and ready for its cross-country sprint to Newark Liberty. The crew was already on board, a flurry of practiced efficiency, prepping for what was meant to be a quick, exclusive hop east. And then she arrived. No red carpet. No phalanx of security detail. No designer luggage trolleys overflowing with conspicuous wealth. Just a woman in her late 30s, dressed in black joggers, a faded hoodie, and beat-up Adidas sneakers. She was scrolling on her phone, her afro pulled into a loose, unpretentious puff, calm, unbothered, utterly self-possessed. Her name was Dr. Nadia R. Holston, but nobody said her name out loud. Not yet. Catherine Morliery, the lead flight attendant, spotted her from inside the cabin. Catherine, a woman whose entire professional persona was a meticulously constructed edifice of polished charm and rigid protocol, frowned. She leaned slightly over to the co-pilot, her voice a low, theatrical whisper, laced with a raised brow of suspicion. "Do we have a last-minute passenger that ops didn't clear?" He shook his head, a faint, perplexed frown mirroring hers. "Not that I know of." Nadia stepped into the plane like she'd done it 100 times before. Not flashy, just familiar. Catherine was already halfway down the aisle to meet her, a syrupy sweet authority coating her voice. "Excuse me, she began, the words dripping with condescension. "This jet is reserved for a private charter." Nadia barely looked up from her phone. "I know." "I'm not sure you do," Catherine said, standing firm in the aisle, blocking Nadia's path. "This is Flight 221 to Newark, chartered by Meridian Lux Aviation for a confidential client." Nadia calmly tucked her phone into her hoodie pocket and looked Catherine directly in the eye. "I'm the client." Catherine didn't laugh, but you could see the smirk fighting a desperate battle to escape her tightly controlled expression. "Right. Do you have some kind of confirmation, because I don't?" "Hey, Catherine." Another flight attendant called from the galley, a younger guy, probably mid-20s, his voice tinged with exasperation. "She's on the manifest. Top of the list." Catherine froze, her lips parting just slightly in a silent gasp. I see." Nadia walked past her slowly, deliberately. Not in a smug way, just like someone who was tired of this exact, exhausting moment playing on repeat. She didn't say anything, but the air shifted, charged with an unspoken tension. You could feel it. But Catherine wasn't done. She watched Nadia place her modest carry-on in the overhead bin, then sink into the cream leather seat like she truly owned the place. Legs crossed, eyes back on her phone, minding her own business. That bothered Catherine. Deeply. The rest of the cabin was empty, save for a discreet older couple seated toward the back, guests of the same charter, both heads buried in newspapers, oblivious to the simmering drama. The engines hadn't even started yet. There was still time. Catherine straightened her skirt, took a deep breath, and approached again, this time leaning slightly over Nadia's seat, her voice flatter now, stripped of its earlier artificial sweetness. I need to ask again. Do you have identification? I just want to verify something." Nadia looked up slowly, her expression unreadable. "Is there a reason I'm being asked twice when your colleague already confirmed I'm on the list?" Catherine didn't flinch. "Standard protocol." "No, it's not." Nadia's tone wasn't raised, but it was sharp, precise, cutting the air clean in half. "I've flown Meridian Lux 12 times this year. I don't remember standard protocol involving being interrogated while boarding my own plane." The younger attendant, whose name tag read Tony, called from the galley again, his voice strained. "Catherine, we're good. Everything's cleared. Ground team just confirmed. Let it go." But she didn't. She moved closer, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper. "Look, I'm trying to protect our clients. This plane is chartered under a high-security clearance. We don't get people showing up in sweats and hoodies without it raising red flags." Nadia blinked. So, the problem is my clothes. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. There was a pause, heavy with unspoken judgment. Then Catherine took one more fatal step, her voice hardening. I don't know who you think you are, but this kind of entitlement doesn't fly here. This is a professional environment. Nadia stood up now, eye to eye with Catherine, taller by maybe 2 inches. Calm. Composed. But now, fully, terrifyingly present in the moment. I didn't think I was anybody, she said, her voice a quiet challenge. You did. Tony stepped forward, finally placing himself between the two women. Let's dial it back, all right? We've got clearance, let's just... But Catherine wasn't hearing it. She looked past him, straight at Nadia. You can either show me who you really are, or you can wait outside while we sort this out. And then Catherine did something that changed everything. She reached for Nadia's arm. Not rough, but forceful, like she was trying to escort her out. Nadia pulled back, gently but firmly. Don't touch me. That should have ended it. But Catherine's ego was louder than her training, louder than reason. She took another step, a bitter, resentful mutter escaping her lips. I'm not doing this today. Then she slapped her. Hard. Right across the face. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't drawn out. Just one sharp, open-handed hit, enough to turn heads, enough to make time stop. Tony gasped. The older couple looked up in disbelief, their newspapers falling to the floor. And Nadia. She didn't yell. She didn't retaliate. She just stood there, one hand to her cheek, as the echo of that moment settled into everyone's chest. Tony was the first to speak, his voice a sharp, incredulous gasp that ripped through the stunned silence. What the hell are you doing? Catherine stammered, her composure utterly shattered. I was trying to get her to leave. Her eyes darted around the cabin, desperate for an ally, for any flicker of understanding. She owns the plane. Tony snapped, his voice ringing with a mix of fury and disbelief. Catherine blinked, her face draining of all color. What? The single word was a fragile whisper, a desperate plea for reality to reassert itself, for the past few seconds to rewind. She's Dr. Nadia Holston, Tony articulated slowly, precisely, as if each syllable were a separate, damning accusation. The new CEO of Vanguard Systems. She's the majority stakeholder in Meridian Lux. This is her jet. And just like that, in a brutal, undeniable flash, the balance of power flipped, shattering Catherine's carefully constructed world. The words hit her like turbulence she hadn't seen coming, a sudden, violent jolt that threw her entire sense of self off kilter. She's the CEO. Catherine's voice was barely audible. Tony nodded slowly, still staring at her as if he couldn't believe what had just transpired. Yeah. Nadia Holston. PhD in aerospace engineering. Net worth north of $2 billion. You just laid hands on the woman who owns the company that signs your paychecks. Catherine opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The air had solidified, trapping the words in her throat. Nadia still hadn't moved. Her hand was down now, her cheek a stark, angry red, but her expression was unreadable, steady, distant, almost surgical. Like a scientist taking meticulous notes on an emotional experiment she was no longer actively participating in. You assaulted a passenger, Tony said, his voice tight with controlled rage. You assaulted the owner. You need to sit down right now. Catherine's eyes flicked around the cabin, frantically searching for backup that simply wasn't coming. The older couple in the back, silent witnesses to the unfolding drama, had gone back to pretending to read their newspapers, though their hands trembled visibly with every page turn. The co-pilot had emerged quietly from the cockpit, standing near the door, arms crossed, his gaze fixed and unblinking. Nadia finally stirred. She turned, and with a calm, almost serene grace, walked back to her seat. She sat down slowly, smoothed her faded hoodie, and pulled her phone from her pocket again. Not to call anyone. Just to scroll. It was so ordinary, so utterly mundane, it felt like whiplash. Tony leaned toward her, his voice quiet, urgent. Do you want to delay the flight? We can report it, escalate to. No, Nadia said simply, without looking up. We're flying. Tony glanced toward Catherine, who remained frozen by the front of the cabin, a statue of terror and regret. She should be removed. Nadia didn't look up, her gaze fixed on her phone screen. No. Let her stay. That surprised everyone, even Tony. You sure? Nadia finally looked up, her eyes meeting Tony's, a faint, almost imperceptible glint within their depths. She's going to sit on this flight like she didn't just make the biggest mistake of her career, Nadia said, her voice low and even, utterly devoid of triumph. That'll be worse than any headline. Tony gave a tight nod. Copy. The engines began to roar softly as the pilots started their pre-flight checks, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the cabin. Tony returned to the galley, his body stiff with unspoken tension. Catherine stayed frozen near the front for a few seconds longer before she quietly, mechanically, took her jump seat. Nobody said another word. No one apologized. No one asked if Nadia was okay. It was just silence. But it wasn't peace. It was pressure, heavy and suffocating, pressing against everyone's lungs. The plane lifted off 20 minutes later, smooth and flawless, ascending into the endless blue. Catherine fumbled through the safety announcements with a voice that cracked twice. Nobody corrected her. Nobody cared. Nadia sat, legs crossed, head tilted back against the headrest, eyes closed. Not asleep. Just thinking. She didn't need revenge. She already had something stronger. Patience. But high up in the clouds, every second of that silence was a countdown. 35 minutes into the flight, not a single word had been spoken between Nadia and Catherine. Catherine sat rigid in her jump seat near the galley, fidgeting incessantly with the strap of her apron, occasionally glancing up to check if anyone was watching. No one was, but she couldn't shake the oppressive weight of what she'd done. Every time she blinked, she saw the look in Nadia's eyes, that cold, unwavering restraint that silenced louder than any yelling could have been. Tony, the younger flight attendant, made himself busy. Too busy. He folded napkins that didn't need folding, rechecked inventory, refilled a water bottle that was already full, all to avoid meeting Catherine's eye or, worse, Nadia's. The older couple in the back whispered softly to each other, shooting nervous glances toward the front of the cabin, wondering what kind of first-class drama they'd just paid to witness. And Nadia. She was still. She hadn't moved much since takeoff. At one point, she pulled out a worn leather notebook and scribbled something with a black pen, not fast, just one deliberate line, then closed it again. Then nothing. It was driving Catherine crazy. She couldn't bear the stillness, the unspoken judgment. She stood suddenly, forcing a facade of composure, and walked toward Nadia's seat. "Would you like anything to drink?" she asked, her voice tight, strained. Nadia looked up. There was no anger in her face, no attitude. Just a long, excruciating pause before she answered, her voice calm, chillingly even. "Do you think I want something from your hands?" Catherine flinched, the words a direct hit. I just thought I should offer." "You thought you could slap me, then bring me sparkling water and think we're square?" Nadia's voice was still calm, but it held the precision of a surgeon's blade. Catherine's voice shrank, barely audible. "I didn't mean to." "You did exactly what you meant to do. The problem is, you thought I couldn't respond." That silence came again, thicker this time, pressing down on Catherine, suffocating her. "I'm sorry," Catherine said, the words barely escaping her lips. "Why?" Nadia tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. I didn't know who you were." Nadia stared at her for a moment, then nodded once, slowly. "What if I was nobody? What if I was just someone flying private for the first time? What if I didn't have a billion-dollar company behind me?" She let that hang in the air for a moment, the unspoken question a condemnation. "You weren't sorry when you thought I was powerless," Nadia continued, her voice gaining a quiet, relentless power. "You're only sorry now that you think you'll lose something." Catherine's eyes dropped, fixed on the expensive carpet. "You're right." The admission was painful, raw. "I know." Nadia turned her head toward the window, ending the conversation. Catherine walked back to the galley without another word, her shoulders slumped. Tony raised an eyebrow as she passed, whispering, "What did you think was going to happen?" "I don't know," she murmured, her voice hollow. "You know that whole plane has cameras, right?" he added, his voice low, filled with a grim sympathy. "Every inch. Including the cabin. It's already recorded." Catherine blinked. "I forgot." Tony shook his head and returned to his tasks. The conversation was over. Nadia sat back, pressing a finger against her cheek for a moment, right where she'd been hit. It didn't hurt anymore, but the bruise wouldn't be physical. It would be policy. Because once they landed, things wouldn't just go back to normal. They'd go exactly the way Nadia wanted them to. The plane flew steady at 40,000 feet, but the cabin felt like it was holding its breath. Catherine sat in the galley, barely blinking, staring into the stainless steel sink like it held answers. Her stomach was in knots. She had worked for Meridian Lux for 6 years, built her reputation from nothing, trained hard, memorized every protocol. She knew how to handle celebrities, royalty, even the weird crypto-millionaires who brought iguanas in Louis Vuitton bags. But today, she made a mistake so basic, so damaging, it made her question everything she thought she knew about people and herself. Nadia had gone quiet again, flipping slowly through a thick folder she pulled from her bag. Inside were diagrams, proposals, engineering drafts. Tony passed by, glanced down, and recognized the logo, Holston Aerospace. She wasn't just rich. She built things. She invented things. Tony hesitated by her seat. "Dr. Holston, I just want to say, what happened wasn't okay, and I'm sorry you had to deal with that." Nadia didn't look up. "You didn't do it." Still, she closed the folder, finally met his eyes. "You ever get tired of pretending like stuff didn't just happen?" Tony nodded. "Every day." Nadia gave a small, half-smile. "Then you'll do all right." Just then, the cockpit door cracked open. The pilot, a tall, older man in his 50s named Captain Rob Templeton, stepped out. He cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping the cabin before landing on Nadia. "Dr. Holston, could I speak with you for a moment?" "Of course." They walked toward the back, where a private conference room, with its tinted windows and soundproof walls, offered a sanctuary of quiet. Tony followed, holding the door open, then closing it softly behind them. Captain Templeton sat across from her at the table, his face calm but serious. "I just got off headset with HQ. They confirmed everything." He paused, a deep sigh escaping him. Catherine's actions. "Well, there's no grey area here. Meridian's legal team is already prepping a response." "I'm not surprised," Nadia said, her voice even. He exhaled slowly. "I've been flying for 30 years. Never seen anything like what just happened. We owe you a formal apology. And Catherine will be grounded the second we touch down." But Nadia leaned forward slightly, her expression unwavering. "That's not enough." Templeton looked at her carefully, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "What are you asking for?" "I'm not just a passenger," she stated, her voice quiet but firm, imbued with an undeniable authority. "I'm the majority shareholder now. I bought controlling interest in Meridian last quarter. This jet is registered to my holding company." She paused, letting the magnitude of her statement settle in the silent room. "That's not a footnote. That's structure." She placed the thick folder she'd been carrying on the table, pushing it gently toward him. "This is what I was working on mid-flight, a new equity policy, comprehensive retraining, company-wide restructuring on internal bias enforcement, transparency in hiring oversight. I was planning to roll it out next quarter." Templeton sat straighter, his eyes fixed on the folder. "I think it's time we push it forward," she said. "Immediately." He nodded, a sudden understanding dawning in his eyes. "You've got my support." "I know I do." Back in the main cabin, Catherine stood up when she saw the conference room door open. She tried to look composed, but her eyes, wide and terrified, gave her away. She watched Nadia step back into the aisle, Captain Templeton following behind her, his face unreadable. Nadia walked past Catherine slowly, didn't speak, but just before she returned to her seat, she paused, turned slightly, and said over her shoulder, her voice cutting through the heavy air, "You don't know who you're talking to, that's the whole problem." Catherine didn't respond. Couldn't. Because there was nothing left to say. But the silence had changed now. It was waiting. Waiting for landing. Waiting for fallout. Waiting for a reckoning. The flight had 2 hours left, but for Catherine, it already felt like it was over. She didn't know if she should stand, sit, cry, or disappear. Her mind was spiraling, replaying the slap, the way Tony had looked at her, the unnerving stillness in Nadia's face. The captain hadn't said a word to her since he returned from the meeting, and that scared her more than anything. She peeked toward the front of the cabin. Nadia was back to her folder, calm, focused, as if none of it had happened. Catherine finally stood up again and walked over to Nadia's seat. "Dr. Holston." Nadia didn't respond. "I know you don't owe me anything, but can I say something, please?" Slowly, Nadia closed her folder and looked up. "I'm listening." Catherine stood with her hands clasped in front of her, her posture radiating vulnerability. "I messed up. Bad. And I don't have an excuse. I judged you. I treated you like you didn't belong, and I didn't even stop to question why. I assumed that." Nadia stared at her for a moment, then nodded once, slowly. "I appreciate the honesty." Catherine's voice cracked. "I know I've lost my job. I know that's coming. I just wanted you to hear it from me before the paperwork shows up." Nadia tilted her head. "What's your name?" "Catherine. Catherine and Morliery." "How long have you been in this job?" 6 years. Before that, I worked for a smaller charter company out of Scottsdale. Did regional flights. Lots of wedding parties and finance brothers." Nadia leaned back. "So, you've seen all kinds of people." "Yes." And still, Nadia's voice remained calm, devoid of judgment. "I walked on this plane in a hoodie and sneakers, and your first thought was that I didn't belong." Catherine looked down. "Yes." Nadia didn't raise her voice. She didn't lecture. She just looked her dead in the eyes and said, "You didn't just see me. You saw who you expected me to be." Catherine nodded, tears welling. "I'll never make that mistake again." "You'll have time to prove that," Nadia said, and then, with an air of finality, turned back to her folder. Tony, watching from the side, stepped closer after Catherine walked away. He leaned in and whispered, "You're letting her keep the job?" "No," Nadia said without looking up. "She'll be removed from flights and put on leave immediately. But if she completes the full retraining program, owns her mistake publicly, and earns her way back through actions, not words, then maybe there's a future." Tony smirked faintly. "That's fair." "It's not about fairness," Nadia stated, her voice quiet but firm. "It's about accountability.